Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha?
It's going well. How are things with you?
Good.
Yeah.
Vernadette Broyles, very interesting woman.
Very interesting. This was a conversation we've been wanting to have for a while. Of course, she's an attorney. She's the president of the Child Parental Rights Campaign. And today we talked about, so many topics that are discussed publicly that we don't often have enough legal details about. So she explained what are some of the consequences of social transition in schools. And this is not just for parents, but as it impacts the students themselves, society at large, teachers, school counselors, everybody involved. She also helped us gain some clarity on what the most recent changes were to Title IX. This is another one of those things that's discussed a lot, but sometimes hard to understand. And she also touched on what happens when CPS gets involved. And listeners will be very surprised to hear that when it comes to gender, we are not talking about proof of abuse. We're talking about just parents who don't want to use a child's name that they came up with 5 minutes ago. And that can be enough to get CPS involved, which was really shocking.
Yeah, Vernadette has a kind of an insider's view on what's going on in schools. And she talks about the parental identity crisis. And, she's really good on it. And she's very much on the parent side. But she's talking about how the schools, motivation to maintain unity with the parents has been dismantled. The schools are often kind of almost working against the parents, certainly in these contexts. We've all been hearing about different scenarios from schools, but it felt like these were real cases. It wasn't urban legend. It wasn't just a story somebody heard. She lifts the lid on very specific cases that she's actually taken court cases on around child protection services, around secret transition in schools, and other issues are on the basis of trans identification and schools overstepping their boundaries. And she also, makes a very good point about immigration and, parents who are maybe religious and religious bigotry being brought into it because it's kind of presumed that if the parents are religious, they're somehow, maybe their views aren't as important as the school's kind of mentality or liberal views or something like that. It does feel like there's a lot going on in schools that we need to examine.
Yeah, the assumption, unfortunately, in some of these cases, that if a family, like you mentioned, an immigrant family who tends to be more religious, maybe they are Muslim, maybe they're Catholic, that they somehow are, assumed to be abusive right off the bat, which is so strange. And she also talks about her role as a guardian ad litem with kind of the foster care system, and how parental unification used to be the goal. It was the highest value. And when there's a kind of a conflict within the family or a parent needs, to shift the way they are parenting, trying to keep that family together was always the kind of number one goal. And with gender, it's almost as though the family is assumed to be inhospitable and dangerous for the child who's questioning their gender. So we covered a lot of important ground here, and it was really interesting. Vernadette's background has really positioned her very well to be working on this issue. She has a law degree from Harvard, and she has an undergraduate biology degree from Yale. So she knows what she's talking about, and you'll be able to hear that in our conversation with her today. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults, and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation. Hi, Stella, and welcome Vernadette to the show. We're so glad you're here.
It's so nice to be with you ladies.
Yeah, there's so much gender going on in schools these days, and you seem to be at the forefront of making sure schools are behaving appropriately. And we need more of you. I think we need a lot of you. But thank God you're here.
Oh, I'm glad to be part of this fight. It's the fight of our times, to safeguard our children. And if not us, then who? So thank you for this conversation we're going to have today.
You mentioned before we started recording a couple of cases that are fascinating that you also think exemplify some of the main legal issues going on with like parental rights, child rights, schools. So can you tell us, what is the Perez case?
Yeah, so Wendell and Maria Perez are a wonderful family. They're a Catholic Christian family, which is relevant, in Florida. So their daughter, I won't name her, but her daughter A, had begun to express gender confusion. She was being bullied. You probably will recognize this pattern. She's being bullied at school, and she internalized this thought, if I were a boy, I'd be stronger. I'd be able to handle this better. And she began to sort of fantasize out loud about being a boy. While a school counselor overheard or heard this in some way, she mentioned it to the school counselor, and the counselor immediately started to affirm her as a boy and began to meet with her privately at school without her parents knowing. The first that her parents find out about what's going on is when they were summoned to the school, had no idea, and when they arrived, they saw their daughter being taken away to a mental health facility in the back of a police car, and were informed that their daughter had attempted suicide at school, actually twice in 2 days. This was the second attempt. And so then as they're meeting with the principal, they learn, and with the school counselor, they learned for the first time that the counselor had been meeting with their daughter privately again for all this time, once a week, I believe, and had been endorsing and affirming this male identity. The conflict between this child's faith, she was a very committed Catholic girl, and living two lives, one life at home, one life at school, was so distressing to her that she legitimately, it was an actual suicide attempt. Now, thankfully, we got immediately involved, and thankfully the parents were able to step in. They brought her home. She's out of that school system. And now that she's away from the influence of this counselor for the school, all gender confusion has completely dissipated. Completely. In fact, she's now at a point where she feels like she had been taken advantage of and wants to sound the alarm for other kids. So yeah, we have filed lawsuit. At the time she was 12, she would be about 14 now.
Wow, she's so young.
Is there not a protocol you'd have to follow that the first time, the first attempt, the first day?
Actually, apparently they didn't know about the first attempt, but they found out about it once they talked with her after the second attempt. So we have filed a federal lawsuit in the Middle District of Florida, and that's making its way through the court system. Yes.
Wow.
Right.
So what are the elements of this case that you think are like important, like symbols or, I guess, examples of stuff that's happening more broadly? I mean, I can identify some guesses here, but what do you think is it about this case that's so important?
Oh, there's several things, Sasha. Great question. One is that there's bullying that precipitates this. Oftentimes there's some sort of conflict. And the school should have immediately begun to involve the parents. Yeah. But instead, they're taking over parenting this child. And it was actually it was the school counselor that promoted this identity. In fact, even promoted sharing this identity with other students. I mean, and that's part of the fact pattern that's so very troubling about this. The advocacy, or I should say that the promotion of this by school officials. The other thing, Sasha, is the purposeful derogating of the parents' faith. One of the reasons they didn't tell the parents is because they knew, and because the child had said, well, my parents won't be in agreement with this. We're Catholic, we're Christians. So they purposely refused to disclose this. They purposely chose not to disclose this to the parents because of their Catholic Christian faith. And they knew that the parents would be in disagreement. So we also have claims for not only violation of their constitutional fundamental parental right, we have a claim for their violation of their free exercise right under the First Amendment. And so, but these are common. These are kind of common fact patterns that we're seeing. We have another very significant case. We're talking about secret transitioning, and we're talking about the consequences of secret transitioning. Let me tell you about this case, and let's talk some more about the consequences of school officials taking over the parenting of children from their actual parents.
Before we move on to the next case, can I ask a question? Because I do think this is important depending on the context for the Perez case. Were there any indications, for example, that the Perez family, due to their religious faith, were going to do something like take her to some sort of faraway remote conversion camp? Like, because just saying that somebody is Catholic doesn't tell you anything about their parenting style, the relationship with the child, how they intervene when they have disagreements, because you can disagree with your child regardless of your religious background in a way that's punitive and harsh or warm and loving. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with faith. So I just want to ask that, because there are some people who think, well, if this is a religious family, then necessarily they would have been very, very punitive, for example. And obviously we hear some detransition stories where people did grow up in punitive, harsh religious backgrounds. So I don't want to dismiss that. But just in the Perez case specifically, was there any indication that that was a risk? Maybe that's why the school was secretive? Like, talk to us about that.
I am so thrilled that you asked that question, because the presumption that a parent, a person, or the parents have a sincere faith, a Christian faith, the presumption that they are therefore irrational or abusive is beyond insulting. It is downright bigoted. It is a form of prejudice, invidious prejudice, that is now being tolerated and fostered in our society, that is in and of itself intolerable. It must stop. And because what's then happening is that people of faith, parents of faith, are being immediately presumed to be abusive unfairly, based upon a status, based upon a fundamental characteristic, based upon faith. And so, no, in this particular case, there was no indicia. The father is a lawyer. He's actually a lawyer with the federal government. He's a hearings officer with the federal government, and the mom is a stay-at-home mom. There was zero evidence of any sort of actual abusiveness. And so I think it's very important that we begin to out this prejudice against people of faith, parents of faith, and call it for what it is. It is bigotry. It is anti-religious discrimination.
And are you allowed to say, just before we move on, are you allowed to say what happened to the kid? She was being carted off in a car as they came in. What happened then, if you're allowed to say it?
Yeah, so I can say what's in the public record. She was placed in a mental health facility. She went to an emergency room, I believe, first, and then to enter a mental health facility for a number of days, until the parents were able to have her discharged and placed in the care of their own physician. So, and during those days while she was there, I tell you, it was a living nightmare, wondering, are their rights going to be removed? What's going to happen next? I cannot tell you how stressful and horrible. And not to mention, as far as they knew, they had sent off a perfectly healthy child to school.
Wow. And a 12-year-old was in a mental health.
Yeah. I also want to touch on, like, when I worked in a charter school in Houston, Texas, the majority of our families were Latin American, a lot of South American, Mexican families, a lot of Nigerian families, and immigrants, and these are individuals and families who tend to be pretty religious, regardless of
Yes.
what their religion is. We had some Muslim kids, we had a lot of Catholic kids.
Yes.
So there's something about this implicit assumption of bias if you're Catholic that is disproportionately impacting like
Yes.
Latino families.
It is. This is a Latino family. They're Puerto Rican. And
Yeah.
as you know, the vast majority of Hispanics are of the Christian faith, and in particular the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, Middle Easterns, the Muslim, which oftentimes have a very similar view of this issue. So you're right. It is disproportionately placing Hispanic families and immigrant families in the crosshairs of being presumed to be abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And it is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, tell us about Blair, the Blair family.
So the Blair family, they were just a Caucasian family. Sage, and the only reason I'm willing to say it's her name is that there's an actual law, a bill that's being proposed in her name, in her honor. And so the parents have consented to her name being out there. Sage was also a 12-year-old girl. And I know you as psychologists, you understand why that 12-year-old phase is such a pivotal phase. Girls are so vulnerable at that time.
Yeah.
She was also being bullied at school. She had early childhood trauma, and was adopted by her parents. And so she began to trans-identify as a male, and the bullying became really horrible. The school district had allowed her to use the male privacy facilities, wherein both on the school bus and in the privacy facility, she's being terribly sexually harassed, including even assaulted. By the boys who were going to teach her to, you know, what it's like to be a boy. I mean, it was just horrible. They threatened her and her family. And in the irrational thinking of 12-year-olds, she thought, I need to run away to protect my family.
Mm-hmm.
And she runs away. She runs into the arms of a waiting pedophile who rapes her and sex traffics her. This little girl had never had a kiss before.
God.
So her entire introduction into her womanhood was the most horrific trauma imaginable.
Horrible. Yeah.
Yes.
The pedophile that you described, is that somebody she had met online, or like, can you say anything about that just very briefly, because I think it's remarkably important.
And part of why we're talking about all of this is to be warning parents about the things that are out there, the dangers that are out there for their children, right? Because we know that sex trafficking and human trafficking is real.
Yeah.
So she had met him online. Honestly, I have to be a little careful because there were actually 2 different episodes of sex trafficking. And at the moment, I don't recall if it was this one or the other one where she met this person. She met the trafficker online. But we know that these pedophiles, these predators, they're out there and they're waiting. They're looking for young girls who are unprotected, unmoored from the protection of their family, and somehow they find them.
Yeah.
So she was then taken across state lines, and the police find her in Maryland. However, rather than returning her to her parents as a victim of sexual abuse, they end up placing her in the juvenile court system. I can't go into details, but it had to do with the allegation that her parents were not sufficiently affirming of the male identity.
Oh my God.
In the juvenile court system, she is assigned a public defender. And I will say this person's name, Anissa Khan. Incredibly unethical. In the public defender's opinion, the parents were not sufficiently affirming. And so the public defender helped to concoct a narrative of abuse for the court that included just wholesale falsehoods for the court. And so the court ends up keeping her in the custody of the state, rather than returning her to the parents. Because she's identifying as a male, this 95-pound, 5-foot-tall, petite girl is placed in at a facility for disturbed boys. What do you think happens to her, Stella and Sasha?
Oh no.
She's obviously assaulted. I mean, how could they not expect that to happen? She's assaulted there. She runs away because she doesn't feel safe. And when she runs away, she is found yet again by actually a different predator who traffics her and takes her into Texas. Now, in the meantime, the FBI, I mean, there's law enforcement there. It was such a drama.
And how old is she, Vernadette, by the time she's in Texas?
This all happens in the course of just a few months. This is quite quick. And she's still 12 years old. And thankfully, the Texas law enforcement have the good sense to return her to her parents. But now she's returned horribly, horribly, horribly traumatized, deeply broken. She has very significant mental health issues now. She can't be in the public school system. And so that's where this situation is. We filed another federal court lawsuit in Virginia against multiple defendants, and that is making its way through the court system.
Have you ever seen anything like this? I mean, I'd love to just for a moment take a quick detour. Like, what were you doing before you got into this work? And have you ever in your career, like, seen anything this shocking? Because I sometimes can't tell if I'm just maybe inexperienced or have been very sheltered. Like the cases that I'm hearing about here are so shocking. Can you just tell us briefly, like, what were you doing before you got into the gender stuff? Were you also doing parental rights? And then what do you think of these shocking cases?
Well, interesting that you'd asked. The work that I was doing before this, I guess I felt it prepared me. I had been a prosecutor in Fulton County, Georgia, actually down in Atlanta, right before as I was having my kids. And then I had been a family law practitioner for 12 years and a guardian ad litem for children in the court system for about 11 years. So I was representing children in the best interest of children in court. So yeah, it prepared me, but I never seen anything like this before. We have entered a new era, a new realm. Yeah.
Could I ask how many cases, like, was what first got you interested? Was it a gender case and then you suddenly started to kind of unpeel the onion? And how many cases are out and about? How many, what's the kind of strike rate? You know what I mean? What's your thoughts around it so that parents know whether there's many cases coming through or are they slow and powerful and small numbered?
Well, Stella, what got me interested in were the stories of detransitioners. I began reading about their stories, and they asked a question. One of them asked a question. I'm trying to remember the person's name because I know her now and I can't. But she asked this question. She said to the parents, to the adults around me, "Why didn't you stop me?"
Oh.
And I was arrested. I was literally arrested by that question. And long story short, I just knew I had been a guardian ad litem to protect children for 11 years. Something inside me just broke. And I just knew I could not continue living life comfortably and practicing law as if this wasn't going on. I had to do something about it. And thankfully, I was able in a position where I shut down my private practice and I created Child and Parental Rights Campaign. The practice that I now have is a public interest nonprofit law firm. We just hired our 5th attorney, a young woman in South Dakota. And we have cases now around the country. You asked about the strike rate. We now, if I'm correct, I believe we have 6. We're about to file our 7th shortly. And they're literally all around the country, in Massachusetts, Florida.
But they're federal.
Wyoming, they're all federal. Virginia, and we have a Title IX case in Georgia. They're all federal, which means they take a tremendous amount of work, and they all take a long time. Any one of these cases can end up in the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And extremely expensive for that matter, but yes.
Yeah, how does the funding work? Because we talked to Josh Payne recently from Campbell Miller Payne, who they're working on detransition lawsuits, and they talked to us a little bit about how the funding works for a law firm taking on these cases that take years and years to unfold. So talk a little bit about your firm and how is all of this funded?
Well, so Sasha, we're a nonprofit, so we do not charge our clients. Any one of these cases could easily be $250,000 between the time that you start them to the time that it wind through the appellate court system, because they're years in the making.
Yeah.
It could be 4, 5, 6, 10 years. And we take very few cases. We have to vet them very carefully because anyone can set precedent. Any one of them can end up at the Supreme Court. This is a whole new field of law. This is an emerging area where I think we filed the first of these kinds of cases. I might be correct. If not the first, the second.
One of the first.
And one of the very first, if not the first. And so we want to make sure that we don't line up a whole string of losses and mess up the field before it starts. So we vet them very carefully, and we're bringing a few until we have some positive precedent that then we can start really unleashing. But in terms of the funding, we don't charge our clients, and they're all, like I said, tremendously expensive. So we do have to fundraise, and we look to just the average people out there who feel like us that this is harmful to children. It is so wrong to drive a wedge between a parent and their child, a child and their parent, at a time, Sasha, when we know these kids need their parents more than ever. And so we look to the public to assist us to be able to bring these cases without charge.
Okay. Well, I'm sure while we continue the conversation, there will be a lot of parents who think this is important, or listeners in general who may want to contribute. So we'll be sure to include any information that listeners can check out. So let's continue talking about cases. You also mentioned a case in Arizona. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Sure. So the other area that is deeply concerning to us that we have gotten involved in is when Child Protective Services gets involved. And once that happens, it is a world of hurt. So our case out of Arizona was the Curran family. We do have their permission to mention their name. Their child was 14, about to turn 15, when she began to trans-identify as a male. After doing a deep dive and binging on the internet and various other influences, she again identified as a male, but then she made a suicidal gesture and ended up in the emergency room. Parents didn't know what to do. They do what parents do. They take their child to the emergency room. And they've never gotten her back. Oh. They've never gotten her. She has never not been home again since then.
How long ago?
That is now 4 years ago, because she's now over 18.
Oh my God.
Can you tell us about the family background? I mean, again, just to play, not devil's advocate, but just, it seems so remarkable that there's a part of me and probably people that are thinking, well, there must have been something going terribly wrong in the family for this child to be taken away and never returned. Because I mean, I'll just say, like, as a school counselor, I have seen some cases where I knew kids were being neglected and abused, and they weren't taken from their homes. Yeah. They had CPS try to work with them and stuff. So how in the world does something like this happen, I guess, is the question on my mind and maybe others.
Sure. The family background is that the father was highly educated, a master's degree in science, and the mom also very, very educated. She was largely a stay-at-home mom. This was a beautiful family, Indian, by the way, Indian American family. Mom was Indian American. Dad was Jewish by heritage, and also a Christian family. So the father, he had done his research, and he came to the firm conclusion that transitioning a child was not supported by the good science. They attempted to get the child mental health care, which is what they felt was the appropriate standard of care. However, and also their faith system was that God didn't make a mistake when he created their daughter. Nothing of these parents, there never had been any sort of history of abuse by these parents. Okay. And nothing to indicate that these were abusive parents. They weren't. It was a loving family. They had a loving relationship with their daughter until this
belief system
began to lay its hold in her. And then she radically changed. She got into various occult practices.
Oh God.
Okay, and very, 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 very dark in terms of her whole persona. I know you all have seen this, but that came into being. Once she got into the system, however, began to affirm her, and now this identification became reified. It became cemented. And she basically claimed, I will commit suicide if I have to be returned to my parents. They're bigots. She had all kinds of accusations against them. CPS came and they took custody of her. Now, this is what's interesting for people to understand. We went through the whole process, and our firm became involved, and I tried the case personally. We actually won. We got custody back for these parents. We were able to show and prove that these were loving, non-abusive parents, and that this child had serious mental health issues, which she did, and she just needed treatment. On the day that the parents were going to go pick her up, the state was completely uncooperative, did not assist them in any way. The state had cut them off from contact with their child and had been completely endorsing this identity, had placed her in a group home that allowed her to begin to do pot. She became addicted to pot, and her mental health plummeted. I mean, plummeted. She went from having one or two basic diagnoses, ADHD and anxiety disorder, to multiple, myriad serious diagnoses.
Oh my God.
So when they go to pick her up, she's in this state of terrible, terrible mental health, had been cutting and self-abusing in the state's care. She was now so indoctrinated in this ideology that she pitched a fit to go with them. She claimed she would kill herself and she would murder them if they would be allowed to take her. So the police, according to the protocols, took her into care.
Yeah.
And then she went right back into the system. This time the judge was not going. She was just not going to hear us again.
This is probably an impossible question, but I'll just ask it because I know parents will be thinking it. Is there anything that you'd say to parents as a kind of a preemptive, like if anything like this happens? Do you know what I mean? That have we anything to work with those parents?
We do. We actually have a resource, and I have it here by my side. Is what parents need to know to deal with Child Protective Services, because we get these calls.
Yeah.
I know, Sasha, we've talked with you.
Yeah.
And so if you all go on our website once again, which I know you're going to show,
we'll link it.
people, your audience goes on our website, they'll find that resource and some others that we will talk about. Real quickly, we also have the resource for what parents need to know to deal with school officials.
Okay.
Because a lot of times this is where it all starts. But going back to your question then, Stella, some of the information that's in here is you need to as soon as you have any indication that CPS may be involved, something your child has said, something a teacher has said that causes you to think, oh my gosh, it looks like they're calling CPS, or they have, immediately retain an attorney, and immediately retain, if you haven't already or we're not working with, a good mental health professional that shares your value system, because it's going to be that team that is going to be able to walk you out of when you get that that knock at the door, how you can respond to that. I will also say, Stella, for those of your American audience, we have a Fourth Amendment in our Constitution. You are not required to allow a Child Protective Services person to come in your house unless they have a warrant.
Oh.
Yes, or a court order. And do not. Your home is your castle. You keep them outside. You close the door behind you. You talk with them calmly. Ask them to understand as much as they are able to share. What is this all about? Thank them for their interest. Assure them your child is safe. And I will make an appointment with you when I can call my attorney. I have an attorney. And when we will make an appointment with you promptly when I can have my attorney come here, and we'll sit down and talk in their presence.
Okay, this is huge for kind of two big things. One reason is that a lot of parents that I've met who have had contact with CPS, they are so terrified and paralyzed that they kind of relinquish their power and authority to CPS, thinking that the more cooperative I am, the better this will go for me. But what ends up happening is actually kind of leading into my second point, which is the way a child perceives the authority structures in his or her life will have a huge bearing on whether or not that child will get better. And with the case that you just described in Arizona, it's remarkable that the more kind of distance there was between parental perspective and all the other authority figures, they lost that child emotionally in the process.
Yes.
Meanwhile, if you as a parent have a therapist who's like, you know, I think your parents have some concerns about you. Let's talk about it together. I'm, going to try to reinforce the parental perspective and also hear the child. And then you have teachers that are referring back to the parents and like, well, your parents know what's best for you. And so like basically if the entire support system around the child is rallied behind mom and dad, again, in the event that they are safe parents, maybe they don't agree with everything, but they're not abusers. Right? Like we would never want to prop up abusive parents.
Yes.
But if the rest of the adults have the parents back, the child will be much healthier in the long run and will not indicate this indoctrinated perspective and this erratic behavior. Like that is what causes the emotional loss of the child in the first place.
Yes. Yes, that is exactly right. In all the cases we have dealt with, we have seen where the system conspires to form a wedge between the child and his or her parent, and more often it's her.
Yeah.
As we know the statistics, the worse the child does. The worse the child does.
But that's established psychologically. Like it's better off, even if the parent has real challenges. Very often, it's better off not to split the parent-child relation. We have that well established. And it's like, yet again, they're throwing out very well established information because of some sort of exceptionalism around gender.
Parental unification, because I had been in the system for a number of years in terms as a guardian ad litem. Parental unification had been the primary goal and policy for decades in our country. Now, obviously, once it has failed and the parents are unremittingly just incapable of caring for their child, and that's been established, there comes a time. We get that. We have a paradigm for that. That's not what's happening in these cases. These are typically loving and engaged parents who are being removed, their influence, their authority is being deliberately interfered with by what kids are encountering on websites, on social media, on the internet, or oftentimes by teachers and by trusted adults in the school systems.
Could I ask, can parents can they write to their schools and a kind of either a cease and desist letter or a preemptive letter saying, do not socially transition my child. She's going through some challenges, and one of them is an identity crisis, but she also has other vulnerabilities, and we are dealing with it. And she's seeing a therapist, and we are legally putting you on notice. You cannot change, for example, her name or her pronouns, and specifically around binders, which are actually shown to be damaging items. Do not damage our child by giving her any free item that is a form of self-harm for some children.
You've touched on a great question, which is something I want to make sure we talk about, and is that how can we empower parents to be proactive and to be able to protect their children? At the end of the day, we are doing this. We are all doing this. You're doing what you're doing. We're doing in the legal sphere because we have taken a very careful look, an intellectual analysis of the data of the known information, and we've interacted with these families, and we've come to the rational conclusion that this is harmful to children. This is harming kids. What we're seeing here, and this ideology is not in their best interest. And so, what can parents do to protect their children? I'm going to go back. Yes, what you've touched on is ultimately what we advise parents to do. You can go back a couple steps before then, all right? And it goes back to what Sasha's talking about. Parents, our kids are having identity crisis because parents have been having an identity crisis. We have slowly ceded our parental authority to third parties, believing somehow incorrectly that others somehow know better, because we're encouraged to believe that. Teachers know better. Someone with some sort of alphabet behind their name, okay, knows better. That's false. That is a falsehood. If you are a loving and engaged parent, you know your child better than anybody else in the world. You are the expert of your own child.
Yeah.
And so parents, number one, need to get over our own identity crisis and establish firmly within ourselves who we are, what our responsibility is, and what our authority is. And there's something about that when you communicate, you come into your identity and you begin to communicate that identity and that authority. There's something about how you comport yourself, how you interact with other people, and how you comport yourself with your child that begins to move and change the dynamic. All right. Your child begins to trust you in ways that they don't. And when you're communicating an insecurity about who you are in their world, they don't trust you like they will when you establish your authority as their parent. Here's what is allowed. Here's what's not allowed. Here's how I'm going to protect you because I love you. We can go into that for a long time about social media, etc. Now, then when it comes to school, communicate that sense of authority to school. Yeah. Be present, very present is what's happening. Be looking at what sort of after-school programs are in your school. If there is a very active GSA club, it's now called the Gender Sexuality Alliance in your school, unfortunately, those clubs have become very activist in drawing kids into this ideology. If there are teachers that are very activists in this arena, that's a canary in the coal mine. So be present and understand what's happening in your children's school. And then finally, communicate to the school leadership like what you're talking about, Stella. Your family's instructions about how your child is to be treated. I would put it in writing. And we actually have on our website.
Oh, wow.
Or it's either on our website or it can be requested of us. We have created a model letter. It was called a notice letter to use with your child's school, where you indicate to them, we are this child's parents and legal guardians. We understand this issue, and we are instructing you. And here is our value system. Our family's value system is such and such. Yeah. Maybe even share what your religion is. We're Muslim, and we believe that whatever. And so if our child begins to identify as anything other than his or her biological sex, we are to be immediately notified. Immediately. We do not grant permission or consent for our child to be treated as anything other than their biological sex for any purpose whatsoever. If they are treated in any other way, we will seek legal counsel.
Brilliant.
CC an attorney. I mean, seriously, put all these things in writing.
Will the schools tell the child that? Because then there'd be a breakdown, between the parent and the children.
I don't care if the school does. You do it. The parent. Okay. Let the child know, hey, by the way, we love you enough, if there's a we, or maybe an I, love you enough that we're going to safeguard your world and we're going to communicate this to the school. You need to inoculate your child. That's the other part of this, is that you need to have the conversations with your child. So many about gender identity that there's like, okay, I'm done. Please, no more. Once they get to that place, it's like, okay, Mom, I've already done it. You've done your job. And here's what you say to them. Sweetheart, if anyone begins to talk to you about questioning if you've been born in the wrong body, or questioning that you're a girl, or questioning how you might feel like you're born, or any question like that, remember this phrase, dear. Memorize this. Take your little hand and hold it up and say, stop. I don't feel safe having this conversation with you. I want to call my mom. I want to call my dad. And make it stop it. You empower your child to know that he or she has the right to demand to be safe from this ideology, and to involve their parents if this happens. I'll stop there. I could go on for a while.
Well, I think that that's probably excellent advice for parents of kids who haven't gotten wrapped up in it yet or are very young, right? Especially if you're an elementary school kid. I mean, I think that goes in line very much with like, you know, telling an elementary school kid, if anyone tries to talk to you about your body or sexual things, say, stop, I'm not comfortable, I want my mom. Like, that's very much in line. But I can only imagine that there's a whole cohort of kids who have already been wrapped up in this. And I often talk with parents in consults and stuff about the internal gears of a clock. They all move each other. So if your kid is online 12 hours a day talking with trans activists, telling them that your parents are transphobic bigots, and the school counselor is saying to them, if your mom doesn't affirm you, then she doesn't really love you. And like, you have all these other influences. If you kind of recommend for your child to talk like that, they're going to be like, oh no, you're already the enemy, mom. Like, it's unfortunate, but that's the position a lot of families are in because their child has already been kind of so influenced from the outside. So that's kind of a very complicated dynamic that comes up.
It is, Sasha. Let me just say this really quickly before we move on. I know we want to talk about Title IX. Yeah. A couple of things. One is that's why I started my response by saying you need to start your parenting on this issue well before your child has been accessed by this ideology, right? It shouldn't be, you should have enough parental control and authority over your household that it is not possible for your child to be spending 12 hours on social media.
Can I add that the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's both. And the other thing I will say is, even with my own child, I started this conversation when she was 14. It's never. I say to parents, it's never too late. It's never too late to have this conversation. It's never too late to course correct. It might be harder. It might be a lot harder to course correct when they're 14 or 15 or 16. But I still contend that kids, I have a 24-year-old, honestly, he's still a kid. Oh. He still wants mom's help and all that. They still have an instinct in them that knows they need parental guidance.
Yes.
All right. And so I still say course correct and do what you can to nevertheless begin to turn the ship in the direction of what we're talking about. Is that fair?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Before we go on to Title IX, just one question about binders. Have we, as a lawyer, you might be able to, this is a question I've often thought, have we kind of given away the point by allowing that being called social transition when actually it's a physical intervention, if you follow me? Because it damages.
That's a great point.
It causes physical damage.
Yes, that's a great point,
Thank
Stella.
you.
That's why we need non-lawyers thinking about these things. That's incredibly practical. That actually begins to be a medical transition.
Yeah.
It has crossed the line into medical transition. You're absolutely correct. I'm gonna change how I talk about this.
That's great. We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups. Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now back to the show.
So Title IX, I'm Irish and I'm clueless.
Well, if I haven't jacked everyone up enough with talking about the stories or cases, be prepared now.
Okay.
So,
we're gonna call the episode "Getting Jacked Up" with Vernadette Broyles.
Right, but before we end, I promise you, we're gonna end on a high note because we're not helpless. We're never helpless until while we're on this side of the grave, we are never.
I love that, and that's the same thing that you said about the parents. You're like, you can still change the direction of the ship even a little bit. So I love that. Okay, so talk to us about Title IX.
So what has happened is that on April 19, 2024, this administration, the Biden administration, and I'm not political about this, I'm just calling the facts as they are. The Biden administration declared war on girls and on parents. And they did so by releasing a set of regulations that they had been in the works for 2 years. And those of us who are on our side trying to protect kids, we were attempting to convince them do not go there. They paid no attention. And so they released these regulations into the Code of Federal Register, which means they are law. They're to be treated as law, that alter Title IX, fundamentally alter Title IX to not simply be about protecting biological sex. It now incorporates gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The real troubling matter is gender identity, because now when you're focused on gender identity and sex at the same time, they're mutually exclusive. They're matter and antimatter. Gender identity overwrites sex.
So what is Title IX in the first place for people who don't know?
Okay. Sorry, Stella. I know you're
clueless.
Well, they're Americans, so don't. No, you're hardly clueless, but even many Americans, Title IX, all they think of is just sports. No, Title IX is far more comprehensive. It is a law that was passed as part of the Civil Rights Law, but it was an amendment in 1972 that, 72, that put in place protections that says schools cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in any aspect of school, in any educational program, in any class, in any sport, math after school, before school, any aspect of school. A school cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And of course, and that had a great benefit on girls and women. It reversed decades of discrimination against girls and women, particularly in higher education, but also in lower education and in sports as well. Interestingly enough, one of the things that it catalyzed was the creation of girls' bathrooms in higher education that didn't exist before, because girls weren't presumed they weren't being educated in some of our higher education, right? It created privacy spaces to protect them. However, now what these new regulations do is that they require immediate and unquestioning affirmation of a student's gender identity upon that student proclaiming it. And it presumes that failing to allow a student to participate in an educational activity consistent with their gender identity, I'm using the words of the regulation, is a form of sex-based harassment. It also presumes that it causes the child harm. So what are the implications of this? Number one is that it now contradicts protections that were put in place based on sex, like privacy facilities. So now you have to now allow access based on gender identity. Well, that means that biological males can force their way into girls' privacy spaces, including locker rooms and changing places, and sports, based upon these new regulations. So now the protections that have been in place for girls have been now overridden. We have a case right now in Georgia. It's a Title IX case where a little girl, 5-year-old girl, was sexually assaulted in a bathroom where a boy was allowed to be there as a result of one of these types of policies. This is the threat to girls is real, and their privacy and their safety. What that does for sports, of course, is that it requires now girls to have to compete against biological males who identify as female, which is categorically unfair, right?
And also, females who identify as boys and go into the men's restrooms are not safe. And if they want to compete against men, they're not safe. So in lots of ways, the girls are being put at risk.
It really, the whole thing puts girls at risk.
Yeah.
Because the thrust of Title IX really was to reverse discrimination that had been happening against girls and women. Yeah. Now, how does this affect parents? This is where I said they declared war on parents. Well, there are a number, not only is affirmation required of affirming the gender identity, there are new authority that's given to Title IX coordinators. Title IX coordinators they're almost like becoming federal law enforcement officers on the school grounds. They have sweeping new authority to enforce these provisions, including bringing complaints, even if a child doesn't want a complaint brought, and providing accommodations to students, including counseling. Now, in none of these things I'm telling you, there's no place where the regulation requires parental notification or consent.
So how does that affect your cases? I mean, that seems terrible for your cases.
So what has been happening in our cases that we just described, which in that situation was under a misunderstanding of Title IX, will now be authorized by these regulations in Title IX. It doesn't affect our cases because the law is not retroactive.
Okay.
However,
Wow.
going forward, there's going to be this titanic battle for parents to be able to assert their parental rights.
Oh my God.
When school officials will be able to say, we're required under federal law
God.
to implement this as federally mandated policy. This is nuclear.
So then in the resource guides, for example, and the kind of letter that you recommend parents to send schools, will this new regulation kind of make all of that obsolete? Or do parents have any recourse whatsoever if they want to prevent their child from, let's say, learning in factual or not factual material at school, or to be talked to about their gender identity? Or does this leave parents with absolutely no way to intervene?
I do not feel it leaves them with no recourse. I still believe that their constitutional right, as an attorney, I assert that their constitutional rights still remain in effect and preempt federal law because the constitutional law is the highest. However, the problem is that we have now thrown everything into total chaos.
Yeah.
We've thrown our schools into chaos. And are parents going to have to bring lawsuits all around the country in order to assert their parental rights? Who can afford it? Where's the army of attorneys who can do it? We have thrown our school systems and the legal parameters of what school officials are entitled to do or even required to do versus parents' authority into total chaos. And you're going to have some school districts that say, and we're already seeing it happen. We've had some governors that have already said, like Ron DeSantis as an example, and I think Texas and a few others, we're not doing this. We're not doing it. We're going to have school systems saying, we're not doing this. We're not going to do this to people. And then others that are like wholesale embracing this because they agree, we're going to have such disorder around our country. Now, what has happened, I do have to tell you, is that we already have now legal Armageddon. War is working out. 21 states that I'm aware of, there might even be more by this point, it might be 22 at this, have filed lawsuits against the Biden administration saying that this is a rewriting of a federal law, Title IX, without going through Congress.
Okay.
And my analysis is that they're absolutely correct. Also, and then all the other parade of horribles this will do for girls, for parental rights, and there are states that have parental rights laws on the books, that have girls' sports protections that they have passed. It throws all of those into chaos. So these lawsuits are going to have to resolve all of this. In the meantime, students and parents are in the midst of this chaos.
Before we wrap up, can you please tell us what we have to be hopeful about?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Good one.
Yes, absolutely. Well, a few things. The first is that, once again, the Constitution trumps. And parental authority has been recognized by the Supreme Court for over 100 years. And so you still have those rights. But more importantly, they derive from something greater than even the Supreme Court. They derive from nature, from the very nature of the human creation. You created these children, all right? And so you're responsible for them. And so my admonition is absolutely do not change a thing of what you're doing about your child. All the advice I just gave, do it. The letter I said, do it. assert your rights, and let the school system go on to pick on some other family, not yours. Okay. We cannot back down. We cannot cede this. Obviously, we have an election coming up. I'm not getting into campaigning, but our elected officials, I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about asserting our rights. They're responsible to us, and part of how we assert our authority is by who we put in office. We have elections coming up. Decide who you could trust to protect your children and to protect your rights. And then finally, we do have a number of resources on our website. I wasn't planning to show this, but I will. We had created in 2020 our Navigating the Transgender Landscape School Resource Guide.
That's amazing.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I wish I could do this online. It's a beautiful,
Well done.
created document, and it's got 250 footnotes and endorsed by 14 medical professionals. So you will find that on the website that you all are going to flash on there under resources. And then we just came out with our latest resource, and this is for churches. I understand all of your audience. You have a diverse audience, but many people do find solace in church. And we knew that the church is an important institution. That's where we got our civil rights law to begin with. So we wrote something for churches to be able to respond effectively to this issue and to be able to help the parents in their midst. Who else is going to come around and stand with parents? The Church Transgender Response Guide. And again, you all will show a way, at the website where they can find these. And then finally, again, for those who are willing, who would like to support these cases, like to support our clients and our ability to take on more, we would love to have the support, the financial support of any of your audience that is able to do so. And I know that you'll flash that as well, the website.
You're very worthy.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah,
are you
really
reading,
good.
watching, listening to anything interesting, gender related or otherwise, that you can share with our audience? Good movies, books?
I am. First of all, there's many good books that are coming out. In fact, this is a wonderful book, Lost in Translation by my good friend, Lost in Transnation by my good friend, Dr. Miriam Grossman. Highly recommend it. And another positive note I want to leave everyone on is I am seeing people across this country, parents, ministers, atheists, agnostics. I am seeing people of different backgrounds waking up on this issue and saying, hell no. The survey came out that came out a number of months ago. About 70% of Americans do not believe that children should be treated in this way.
You've got to get out there.
People really are waking up. I do believe we're on a precipice. We are. But we have truth on our side, and we have love on our side, and we have the rights of children on our side. People are waking up. We're going to prevail. It may take time. It may cause we have some suffering in the short term. But Sasha, Stella, I promise you, I commit to you, so long as there's breath in my lungs, we will prevail on this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vernadette.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.